The subcommittee will come to order. Members take their seats. We get the door closed, please. Thank you. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up the committee print. The bill was open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the bill? Yes. For what purpose does the ranking member of the full committee seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk number 3.
The clerk will report amendment number 3.
Amendment to discussion draft offered by Mr. Pallone.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've known for years that unsafe disposal of coal ash poses serious threats to human health and the environment. EPA first determined that national disposal criteria for coal ash were necessary 15 years ago, and since then they have conducted a robust public rulemaking process, including extensive analysis, field hearings, and multiple rounds of public comment. In December, EPA finalized minimum federal criteria to address this serious environmental problem. The final rule reflects the input over 450,000 public commenters, including states, industry groups, environmental groups, and individual concerned citizens. But despite this forward progress, some on the subcommittee still think that legislation is needed. Some say we have too much enforcement. Some say too little. Some say we need more certainty. Some say we need more flexibility. But what is definitely not needed is a bill that scales back the minimum requirements in EPA's final rule, and that's exactly what this bill does. So my amendment does what members of this subcommittee have said they wanted all along, to require all state permit programs to include the minimum requirements in EPA's final rule. EPA has spent years developing sound technical standards that are protective of human health and the environment. As we heard during the legislative hearing, the bill weakens provisions of EPA's final rules, such as groundwater protection standards and cleanup requirements, and eliminates other like location restrictions, liner requirements for existing surface impoundments, and closure requirements for deficient structures. So my amendment would put all the protective requirements of EPA's rule, not just some, into the bill's framework for state permit programs. It would keep intact the new federal floor of protections. It would ensure adequate safeguards for clean air and water, and it would ensure public access to important information. I'd ask my colleagues to vote yes to fully incorporate the requirements of EPA's final rule into this bill. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Anyone member seeking recognition on this amendment? Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Chairman,
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would oppose this amendment because it just we heard from the states and utilities at both of our hearings on this issue that because the rule was written as a self-implementing rule, that there would be key places that the agency would have incorporated certain flexibility if there were state oversight and if the rule were implemented through enforceable permits. Secretary Stanislaus acknowledged that the rule would have been written differently if it had been implemented through the permitting program. The legislation incorporates the flexibility back into the state permit program, and this amendment would completely negate these efforts. The amendment flies in the face of everything we're trying to accomplish here with this, and it goes back, just would undo a lot of the efforts of all of the stakeholders and working with the EPA in trying to accomplish this. So I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Anyone member seeking, gentleman from New York, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The EPA made certain that there were protections in their rule that they deem essential for the best outcome. We've received testimony, some confusion as to what's in, what's out, whether it's there or whether it's not part of the package. And I think that this amendment addresses, I support Mr. Pallone's amendment because I believe he addresses any possible confusion that, that might arise, therefore incorporating fully EPA's final rule. EPA has determined that the requirements in the rule are those that are essential to address the risks from coal ash and to provide adequate protections for public health purposes and for the environment. Picking and choosing from the federal requirements will not ensure that coal ash disposal is done safely, and weakening the federal requirements will only guarantee that the risks remain high. I oppose this bill and think it's unnecessary, but at least this amendment ensures that EPA's criteria are fully incorporated into the bill's framework for state permit programs. This amendment does what this bill was supposed to do all along, and I thank my colleague for offering it. Without it, the unsafe disposal of coal ash will likely continue, and that the American people will continue to suffer the related consequences. So I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, to vote yes on Mr. Pallone's amendment. That would improve this bill, and with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Tonka, can I just ask you to yield for 1 minute?
Absolutely. I yield to Mr. Pallone.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. You know, as far as the gentleman from West Virginia is concerned, I mean, I think he's being very honest in what he's saying, and you know, I understand where he's coming from, but that's exactly the problem. In other words, if you have if states have the flexibility, then there is no federal floor of protections. And I know that some on the other side have suggested that that they want to have the minimum requirements in EPA's final rule incorporated into the bill, but as the gentleman from West Virginia says, that isn't the case. So, I mean, he's being honest about that, and I appreciate it, but if you go along with what he's suggesting, then the bottom line is that we don't have the federal floor protections. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York, Yellow Pack. Thank you. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition. So the whole thing that we're trying to do is take the reg, put it into federal code, make it law, under the testimony that we've heard that for it to be applicable, it has you have to have discretion by the states, very similar to the discretion afforded by the municipal solid waste regulations. So we're just doing what we've done in the municipal solid waste, and we're just applying it to coal ash. The EPA has been very helpful so that coal ash is no longer being labeled as toxic. But now the whole intent is to have minimum standards with a certification program that the states can then comply to. There is a minimum standard, and it's just, again, simple. So what my colleague attempts to do is just force the implementation of the reg without the flexibility. And flexibility, as testified, is key for the states to be able to do the job they're being asked to do. So I appreciate the concerns of my colleague.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield.
I mean, I'm just trying to make a point here, and I think the point's been made, which is that the bottom line is the way this bill reads without my amendment is that states can pretty much do what they want. I mean, it's true that generally speaking, with most EPA regulatory schemes or process, and you know, in my own state of New Jersey, we have so much industrial pollution from the past that, you know, that states are allowed flexibility, but they have to meet certain minimum requirements. And what you're saying with this bill is that there are no minimum requirements. States have the flexibility basically to do what they want. And I think the gentleman from West Virginia was pretty honest in saying that. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. So I understand what the chairman's trying to say, but I mean, the bottom line is if the flexibility exists and there's no minimum requirements, the states can do what they want.
We're claiming there is minimum requirements. That's the whole aspect. And when we tried to get the EPA assistant administrator to confirm section by section, he in essence refused to do so. So we've taken right out the code. Because a final rule is self-implementing, EPA did not include certain elements from the June 2010 proposed rule that would have allowed modification of certain requirements based on site-specific factors because of the absence of a state regulatory oversight. Because the draft legislation would require EPA's rule to be implemented with either state or EPA regulatory oversight, the bill restores the ability of the implementing agency to modify in limited instances elements of the rule to take into account site-specific risk-based factors, which is, again, similar to what we do in the federal municipal solid waste regulations in Part 258.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if you just yield, I just don't see how there's how there's any real standard under the circumstances you described. But look, I think
Chairman,
we've
we yield.
debated this enough. I'm not going to keep going.
No, it's fine, and I appreciate that. I'll yield to Mr. McKinley.
Just again, in the remarks that were made yesterday, and they were not refuted, and that was that this draft legislation includes all of the provisions of the final rule, except for two provisions. One was a notification requirement and the publicly accessible internet site requirements. Other than that, it's the rule. It's what they passed.
Again,
yield
Mr.
back.
Chairman,
Let me reclaim my time yielding to the ranking.
I guess, you know, it just seems to me that if we don't have any standard, or if the standard can just be waived, then I don't know how you have any standard or minimum requirements. But anyway, I think we've made the point, so I'll leave it alone at this time.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments, and thank you for those. Anyone else wishing to speak on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey? If there are no further discussions, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor so signify by saying aye. Gentleman requests a roll call vote. We'll conduct a roll call vote.
Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Lotta? Mr. Lotta votes no. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores votes no. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Kramer? Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes no.
I think the member needs to be in the chamber.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Yes.
Mr. Tonko votes yes. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader votes yes. Mr. Green? Ms. DeGette? Ms. Capps?
Votes yes.
Ms. Capps votes yes. Mr. Doyle? Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes yes. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Pallone?
Yes.
Chairman Shimkus?
No. Clerk will report. I believe the gentleman's not recorded.
Mr. Green votes yes.
We did okay. Any other members wishing to vote? Will the clerk report?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeses were, or the nays were 12 and the nays were 6. What?
Let's do that again.
My apologies. The 12s were, the noes were 12. And, okay. No,
Take your time.
the yeses were 6 and the noes were 12.
So the nays prevail. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any amendments to the bill? For a person, gentlelady from California, rise.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Number 1. Amendment to discussion draft offered by
Ms.
Mrs.
Capps.
Capps.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
I have, this amendment is to the bill, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which has a simple purpose: to protect public health and the environment from unsafe disposal of solid waste. Regulations for municipal solid waste must include criteria necessary to protect human health and the environment. EPA's new final rule on coal ash also embodies this protective standard, but this bill before us would eliminate that standard for coal ash. If this bill is adopted as is, coal ash will be the only waste not held to a standard of protection under RCRA. Not only does this bill exclude some of the requirements EPA deemed necessary in the final rule, it provides significant discretion to the states. And importantly, when EPA reviews the sufficiency of state permit programs under this bill, it cannot even ask whether or not the program adequately protects public health and the environment. Yesterday, one of my Republican colleagues asked what the difference is between the discretion given for municipal solid waste programs and the discretion that would be given under this bill. The the legal standard of protection is that difference. Under current law, state municipal solid waste programs are reviewed by EPA against a legal standard of protection. In contrast, permit programs under this bill would not face the same review. My amendment would fix this by holding state coal ash programs to the same legal standard as state municipal solid waste programs. And it wouldn't be hard for states to meet this standard because in its final rule, EPA laid out a template for a program that meets this standard. This is a simple amendment that to ensure we are doing what is necessary to protect human health and the environment. Without it, the health of our families, communities, and our environment are at risk. I ask and urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment, and I have time to either yield back or yield to any of my colleagues. I yield. Okay. I yield to my colleague, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Capps. I want to urge my colleagues to support this very simple but important amendment. There seems to me this morning we've seen a basic disagreement about whether the bill provides a floor or not. And so what this amendment does is make sure that we have a floor. When authority is delegated to the states under the RCRA, the states are held to legal standards of protectiveness. These standards are the yardsticks by which is determined whether a state's efforts measure up, and they ensure a consistent level of effort and protection throughout the nation. This approach has worked well because it ensures that every American family enjoys a basic level of protection, a floor. It prevents a race to the bottom among the states in which a state willing to have the laxest protection becomes a dumping ground for the neighboring states, and it prevents unfairness of one state allowing a facility within its borders to contaminate an adjacent state. The CRS has identified the lack of standards of protection in previous versions of coal ash legislation as a significant issue. The bill we are considering today has the same basic fundamental flaw, a lack of standard of protectiveness. This bill contains no consistent national standard to protect against the risk of coal ash and no guarantee that states' programs will be protective. The risks from coal ash are real, they are significant. We should be working to address them, not insisting on legislation that is flawed. The American people deserve better. While I don't support this legislation, I think the amendment will go a long way to make a big improvement. And again, I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back to Ms. Capps.
I yield back.
Generally yields back time. Anyone speak? Mr. McKinley seeks recognition. 5 minutes to speak, I believe, in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find this interesting with this provision because there are some people saying we don't need this legislation at all, and the rule should be able to take into effect. But they're saying the rule may not go far enough. I think it's interesting because it comes from the EPA. That brings us back to this amendment. It brings us back to where we were 4 years ago, and to insert protect human health and environment as a subjective standard into this minimum requirements that the EPA has set up, and we're adopting into this, serves as a federal baseline for protection in legislation. The minimum requirements were crafted in such a way, in coordination with the EPA, that we set up a federal guideline to provide those safety to protect human health and the environment. They already are in that because they set the rule. And we're trying to adopt the basis of this rule as the basis for where we go with this. So I appreciate my colleagues' concerns. We've had this amendment many times before, and the effect of adding, quote, protect human health standards into the minimum requirements is still the same. It's an attempt to set up a subjective yardstick for litigation. And the federal district judges, the EPA, are going to get, we establish confusion with this issue, and it allows litigants to get into this and challenge it. The EPA has the tools in this. If they think this permit is failing to meet the minimum requirements for health and safety, the legislation gives the EPA specific criteria to address and access that state permit to be protective. So I would urge the rejection of the amendment. Yield back my
Gentleman yields back his time. I'm sorry, I didn't know she wanted to get time yielded. Mr. McKinley, will you yield time to the gentlelady from California?
Yes.
You have remaining.
Thank you very much for yielding. And I just want to make the point, as a public health nurse for many, many years, I do believe this nation does have standards of public health, and that these are not subjective, but breathing clean air and drinking clean water, and certain standards have been held. I know this is about a debate about what those standards should be, but it's certainly, I hope, understood that we do have a role to play in Congress and in the public health system for setting standards of health and safety. And I will yield to a colleague, or I'll yield back.
But
The time is gentleman from West Virginia, so.
I hear that, and I think that's what this legislation is trying to provide, is give the states using the minimum. If you in California want to have a higher standard for air and water quality, then set the standard. But there's going to be a minimum standard that is set in the rules and regs. They've already passed the final rule to take care of this. So I think it's resolved. If you want to make it more stringent for your health, that's the option of California to be able to do that. Other states may want to have something that's slightly different, but not below the minimum. So I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Anyone, any other member seeking recognition on the amendment? Seeing. Okay. Gentleman is asking for a roll call vote on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps. A roll call will be conducted. Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Lotta. Mr. Lotta votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes no. Mr. Tonko.
Yes.
Mr. Tonko votes yes. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes yes. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes yes. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes yes. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes yes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes yes. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes yes. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes yes. Chairman Shimkus. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 8 ayes and 12 nays.
The vote is 12 nays and 8 yeas. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding the committee print to the full committee. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. If you're requesting that. Right. All those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. And the gentleman from New Jersey requests a roll call vote, so the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Mass. Chair?
Yes, the chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I oppose this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to join me in opposition. In past Congresses, we were told that EPA wanted this bill to close gaps in its authority under Subtitle D of RCRA. Well, now we hear that EPA thinks their authority is strong and has no gaps. The witness yesterday reiterated that point. In past Congresses, we were told that this bill was necessary to ensure that EPA would not regulate coal ash as hazardous and restrict beneficial reuse. Well, EPA reiterated yesterday that they're not regulating coal ash as hazardous, and they are not restricting beneficial reuse. We all heard Mr. Stanislaus say that EPA is not doing so now, and they have no plans to do so as we move forward. We can all agree that coal ash can pose serious risks when not disposed of properly. Now, for the first time, we have minimum federal requirements that set a floor of public health and the environmental protections. The old arguments are now moot, but still some are pursuing legislation. Why? Well, now we're told that Subtitle D will not include effective enforcement. In fact, we're being told that by stakeholders who specifically sought a Subtitle D rule. Importantly, EPA is not concerned about the enforcement of its rule. We heard just yesterday that it expects strong enforcement through a combination of citizen suits and state adoption of the requirements. Now we're also hearing that the rule will lead to dual enforcement. Too little or too much, it seems the advocates cannot decide. But again, EPA is not concerned about this potential problem. As we heard yesterday, EPA believes it has effectively addressed any concerns about dual enforcement by establishing a mechanism to review and approve state plans. So the old arguments for this legislation are now moot, and the new arguments purely speculative. EPA has confidence in its final rule, and so do I. We should not overrule the public process that we went into it and undermine its protections. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill, and with that, Mr. Chair, I...
Gentleman yields back his time. The clerk will now call the roll.
Mr. Harper. Aye. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Aye. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Lotta. Mr. Lotta votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Schrader. Aye. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Green. Aye. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. Capps. No. Ms. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Yes. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Mr. McNerney. No. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Cardenas. No. Mr. Cardina votes no. Mr. Pallone. No. Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Shimkus.
Aye.
Chairman Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 ayes and 5 nays.
16 ayes and 5 nays. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills reported by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.